the Journal of 9/11 Studies is going to focus largely on new areas that haven't been investigated as much. We would like to really shift the focus, and I want to say this is another important goal of the organization, is to start to not take the focus away from the World Trade Center, but to start to shed more light and put more resources and more focus into other aspects of 9/11 that haven't received as much attention over the years, in large part because the World Trade Center evidence is so straightforward. But we feel that other aspects of 9/11 are sort of fertile ground for there to be significant discoveries that could really advance our understanding of 9/11 and maybe provide evidentiary breakthroughs. So we'll see. One area that the journal is not going to focus on as much are topics that have been debated a lot over the years. The foremost of those, of course, is the question of what did or did not hit the Pentagon. I would like to be very clear from the outset that the organization does not have a formal position on the question of what did or did not hit the Pentagon. I mentioned that David Chandler is a board member of the organization. As many of us know, he's been very outspoken on this question, but the organization as a whole is not taking a position on it. What we do want to do, rather than continuing to sort of foster the shadow or the cloud that hangs over this question, is to allow it to be discussed and debated civilly and respectfully out in the open in what we are calling this debate.
Out with the old and in with the new. That was Ted Walter, formerly of Architects and Engineers, and now the newly minted director and creator of the group, the International Center for 9/11 Justice. I don't know what to make of it, but already it has problems. And we're going to be talking about some of those problems today in this video, in which I'm going to make a three-part series to, addressing the three problems I have with their 10 directives. And their website seems to be pretty good. It's pretty refreshed. I mean, here's a website here. I'm going to link it at the bottom of the screen so you could take a visit. We're a director, who we are, their mission, their vision, and who we are. The mission is the International Center for 9/11 Justice is a nonprofit research and educational institute dedicated to establishing an accurate account of the 9/11 attacks and to fostering a global realization, reckoning about the causes of this world-changing crime against humanity. Vision. Our vision is the creation of a post 9/11 world. By this, we mean a society that is no longer shaped by the false official account of 9/11, that is committed to eradicating the elite criminality and institutional corruption that produced the 9/11 atrocities and facilitated their cover-up. It is a world that puts an end to the immoral and destructive policies enacted after 9/11 and begin to live up to the principles of peace, justice, freedom, and true democratic governance. What we do. Pay attention to here. The center engages in research and educational activities that are international in scope and multidisciplinary in nature. These activities fall into three categories. 1, organizing, preserving, and presenting the best empirical 9/11 research and enormous amount of data that have been produced over the last 2 decades. Now, if you just heard the introductory video to what Ted Walter said, they don't have a position regarding the Pentagon. And I know why, right off the bat. They don't want to alienate what they're trying to build, which is an audience. If your first directive is to present the best empirical 9/11 research and enormous amount of data been produced over the last 2 decades, this argument about the Pentagon is over. One of your board members is David Chandler, in which you mentioned in the introductory video, Mr. Walter, and you said, I know about the work that Chandler put in about the Pentagon. Do you also know about the antagonistic reflexes and responses by those who promote false theories? Do you know the many years of threats that he had to engage? And yet you are basically trying to alienate or disassociate from being a victim of this. And basically, you're putting yourself in a safe space saying that, oh, we really don't have a position on the Pentagon. This argument was done on September 11, 2001. You shouldn't care what no planers think. You shouldn't care what people who promote planting debris or fake phone calls or CGI holograms or switched out drones. None of these people have empirical research or data to represent their arguments. None of these people are taken seriously on even a superficial platform, much less the alt media platform. Why would you, if your organization is based on the best empirical 9/11 research, why would you not take a position? The empirical research is there. From the analytical evidence, the NTSB, the FAA, radar satellite data that shows Flight 77 taking off out of Dulles, crashing into the Pentagon, the physical evidence of the landing gear, the fuselage, the flight data recorder, the human remains of passengers and crew that were found, the eyewitness evidence of over 100 people witnessing an American Airlines plane crash into the Pentagon. But you knew all this because David Chandler or Wayne Costi gave, or you saw the research that they've done regarding this in Wayne Costi's report to the 9/11 consensus panel. And what did you do, Ted Walter? You hired some of those people from the panel. People that don't believe a hijacked plane crashed at the Pentagon, like Elizabeth Woodruff or Kevin Ryan. Point 2, conducting new research into all aspects of 9/11 attacks. I'm with that because architects and engineers only focus on the physics. I understand. 9/11 consensus panel, their problem was they got a bunch of people who already said that the official narrative is false. And so they looked into research and information that acquiesced to that worldview. That's not what a researcher does. A researcher just goes by the evidence without making a prejudgment before he does the research. And like I said before, you don't go to 9/11 and basically say, I know what didn't happen. If you're going to say the 9/11 Commission report is false, you're working on a false premise. You have to show it is false first. What points in the report is false? What points in the Joint House inquiry are false? What's missing? That's even the better question. Point 3, mounting actions aimed at raising mass public awareness and sparking broad-based demand for justice for the millions of people affected by 9/11 and its aftermath. How are you going to do that? It's 22 years down the line. Last year, I went to Ground Zero. I saw Gene Laratonda, Sandra Gelmy, Dr. Richard Elfritz, Glenn Zarmanoff, and like 6 others. You're not reaching anybody. And especially if you're not going to touch what I think you're not going to touch on, which is the pre-intelligence aspects of 9/11. And if you are, you're basically going to endorse or support, tentatively, the fringe conspiracies attributed with it. Or else you wouldn't have hired Woodruff and Ryan on your board. You think they're going to talk about the Bin Laden issue station? You think they're going to know who Tom Wilshire is? Much less the connection to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing or Bajinka plot? You hired the wrong people. Now, if your organization was based on, say, old rehash arguments of the World Trade Center, old rehash arguments about what didn't happen or did happen at the Pentagon Shanksville, well, you got the right board. But if mounting actions are aimed at raising public awareness and sparking broad-based demand for justice, heck, you got to touch on the subjects you didn't even dare dream of imagining touching on. And neither did some of those people on the board. That's what you're going to have to touch on. And you're going to have to make a decision whether you're going to say, listen, we're just going to stick with the evidence and the facts. To hell with other people are saying. Well, then you're going to have to make a decision on the Pentagon and Shanksville. If you don't, no one's taking you seriously. You're going to follow the way of the 9/11 consensus panel, Pilots for 9/11 Truth, Loose Change, and every other truther organization that was hot for a minute, but then fizzled out because all they kept doing was repeating themselves. They learned nothing new, because learning something new means that your previous held beliefs have to change. And it seems, based on your own words, Mr. Walter, you're not willing to do that. So, what are the 10 reasons the official count of 9/11 is impossible? Not improbable. Look at the headline. 10 reasons the official count of 9/11 is impossible. That's a definitive statement. Impossible. It means it couldn't have happened. And the first point is the hijackings. The hijackings, as we were told, was impossible, according to this organization. It is exceedingly improbable. Well, you change a word. That all 8 pilots on the 4 airliners would have failed to enter the Universal Hijack Code into their transponders, and that all 8 pilots would have either given up control of the aircraft or been incapacitated without first performing a violent flight control maneuver to thwart an invasion of the cockpit. 2, the phone calls. It is impossible that more than a dozen cell phone calls allegedly made by passengers and flight attendants on the 4 airliners took place as reported by the media in the first few years after 9/11. In nearly all cases, the airliners were too high for cell phone calls to go through. Apparently recognizing this problem, the FBI unveiled a news story during the 2006 trial of Zacchaeus Moussaoui, claiming that all of the calls, except for 2 allegedly made at a lower altitude of 5,000 feet, were made from seatback phones. However, in the case of 2 passengers whom the FBI now allegedly made calls from the seatback phones, there was good evidence that the calls were made from the passengers' cell phones. I'm not going to read all that. 3, the piloting of the airplanes. It is virtually impossible that the alleged hijackers knew to be marginally trained and barely competent pilots could have successfully navigated to specific points using the airplane's navigation systems and then maneuvered the airplanes at high speeds into the Twin Towers and Pentagon. According to Lieutenant Colonel David Gapp, an Air Force veteran, and many other pilots have also stated that Hani Hanjour, the alleged hijacker of 77, would have no chance of executing the reported flight past the Pentagon. Ultimately, the evidence points to airplanes having been piloted by individuals other than the alleged hijackers or under computer control technology that existed before 9/11. And I don't have any other problem with the other 6. It talks about the World Trade Center and the technical, physical aspects of it. But in today's video, I just want to touch on the hijackings. I'll do 2 other videos based on the phone calls, the piloting of the airplanes, right? But a little bit here. Already, you see where this organization is going. They're going the way of David Ray Griffin. David Ray Griffin, is now deceased, was a long time 9/11 truth advocate. He wrote, I think, 12 books. And every single points regarding the phone calls and the hijackings that he's made over the years, he never rectified. They've been repeated ad nauseum at groups like 9/11 Consensus Panel, echoed by Richard Gage, formerly of Architects and 9/11 architects and engineers of 9/11, repeated by pilots for 9/11 Truth, repeated by Loose Change. You know what happened to all these groups. They're no longer active. This is what's going to happen to Ted Walter. We have seen this before. I have yet to see a 9/11 Truth organization that touch on the pre-intelligence aspects of 9/11. Why? Because they question the hijackers. If you question the hijackers, you question and don't study the intelligence aspect connected to them. And even if you try to align the intelligence aspect to them, you're saying that they created the hijackers in the first place, or that the hijackers are patsies and living somewhere. This is where this organization is going, because they're not interested in alienating the fringe community of 9/11. They don't have the guts to do it. They just don't. Because I think Ted Walter knows he doesn't want what happened to David Chandler and Wayne Costi and Ken Jenkins and Warren Stutt and others. He doesn't need the harassment. He's a young man. He doesn't need it. He wants followers. He wants an audience. In order to get that, you have to entertain the fringe community. If you were actually just interested in the true Ted Walter, you wouldn't dare or care to entertain these people. They're nobody. I'm not talking about the victims of these people. They're victims. I'm talking about certain people like Barbara Honegger, Davon Kleist, Jason Burmis, anybody from Pilots for 9/11 Truth, Kevin Ryan, Elizabeth Woodruff, the David Ray Griffin crowd. You wouldn't have anything to do with these people. On your panel, if you were really interested in getting down to the truth of 9/11, you would have Ali Soufan. You'd have Mark Rossini. You'd have Ken Williams. You'd have Anthony Schaefer. You don't even know who these people are. I'm going to assume you don't. I could be wrong. These are the people who are actual whistleblowers. Barbara Honegger is not a whistleblower. She never got in trouble for blowing the whistle on anything. The people I mentioned did. Their careers, some of them were ruined. Some went through hell. Thomas Drake was another, the biggest whistleblower of the last 50 years, since Ellsberg, or Snowden, or Manning. But in my mind, Thomas Drake is the most important when it comes to 9/11. So let's get right to it, all right? So here we have the hijackings. It is exceedingly improbable that all 8 pilots of the four-liners would have failed to enter the universal hijack code into their transponders, and that all 8 pilots would have either given up control of the aircraft or have incapacitated without first performing a violent flight control maneuver to thwart an invasion of the cockpit. Armchair quarterbacking, that's all this is. First of all, you're comparing a traditional hijacking to a martyrdom hijacking. Mistake number one. In a traditional hijacking, you have people who are announcing a hijacking while detaining the passengers and crew. The pilots are hearing this, and then they can enter the squawk code. They have the time to do it because they didn't get to the pilots first. Martyrdom hijacking goes as follows, Mr. Walter. They don't announce there's a hijacking because they don't want to be incapacitated. The first thing that they did was get up and go right to the cockpit before they can even do anything because they're strapped in their seats. All the hijackings took place in the air, meaning that the pilot and the first officer cannot do anything. They're strapped in their seats. Fight back, nothing. By the time they even realize what's going on, there's a razor blade to their throat. You ever make cup with a razor blade? You ain't going to do nothing. You're going to be frozen in fear. And especially if they're realizing that there's somebody in cockpit, all of a sudden there's a knife to their throat because some of these people had knives, not just box cutters, and they're already attacking you. You're not going to have time or the concentration to put in 7500, which is the hijack code, which you're saying takes only 3 or 4 seconds. Yeah, if they announce they're hijacking. Not when they're rushing into the cockpit and you're turning around to see what's going on. Because first natural reaction is you're not going to say, well, let's put the hijacking, but you're going to turn around to see what the hell's going on. What's this? And you see guys with knives and box cutters and maybe in an instant, a gun. That's what the draft report said for Flight 11. But let's leave that to the side. What we do know through the evidence is that they had knives, long knives, and box cutters. So they're not going to have time to put in the squawk code. So you didn't even entertain this because I can understand. You're comparing this to a traditional hijacking, mistake number 1. Now, I'm going to read an article to you about an FBI agent named Brian Sullivan who wrote a letter to John Kerry, Senator Kerry. And that this article is from Citizen News, right? John Kerry ignored pre-9/11 warning for Logan International Airport. Brian Sullivan, FAA agent, personally warned Kerry May of 2001. Now, here's the article. I'm going to blow it up just one more time so that people can actually read it. Because I want you to read it as well. John Kerry ignored pre-9/11 warning for Logan International Airport. Brian Sullivan, FAA agent, personally warned John Kerry May of 2001. The following article can no longer be found on the internet at its original source. A copy from the Wayback Machine is used. Senator John Kerry boasts how he sounded the alarm on terrorism years before 9/11, referring to his 1997 book, The New War. Too bad he didn't blast it when it really counted. 4 months before the hijackings, when he was hand-delivered evidence of serious security breaches at Logan International Airport with specific warnings that terrorists could exploit them. Former FAA security officials say the Massachusetts Center had the power to prevent at least the Boston hijackings and save the World Trade Center thousands of lives, yet he failed to take effective action after they gave him a prophetic warning that the state's main airport was vulnerable to multiple hijackings. He just did the Pontius Pilate thing and passed the buck on back through the federal bureaucracy, said Brian Sullivan, a retired FAA special agent from Boston, who in May 2001 personally warned Kerry that Logan was ripe for a jihad suicide operation, a martyrdom operation, possibly involving a coordinated attack. How did he know about that? Because all throughout 2001, there was information, going back to 1999, that there was information gleaned from interviewing people from the Bajinka plot and Ahmed Rassam, one of the primary operators of the Millennium Plot, which told their investigators what Al-Qaeda was planning, that they were going to hijack planes and crash them inside the United States. That's the real conspiracy, Mr. Walter, is that the government knew as far back as 96 through their interrogation of one of the Bajinka plot plotters, Abdul Hakim Murad, in which he gave Philippine investigators the secret plot to the Bajik plot where 9/11 came from, that they were going to hijack 10 planes and crash them all over the intercontinental United States. Rewind to May 6, 2001. That night, a Boston TV station aired reporter Deborah Sherman's story on an undercover investigation at Logan that Sullivan, another retired agent, helped set up. The next day, Sullivan fired off a 2-page letter to Senator Kerry highlighting the systematic failures. Quote, with the concept of jihad, do you think it would be difficult for a determined terrorist to get on a plane and destroy himself and all other passengers, he warned? Think what the result would be of a coordinated attack, which took down several domestic flights on the same day. This is May 2001. With our current screening, this is more than possible. It is almost likely. The toll from such an attack would be economic as well as human, he predicted with chilling accuracy. More than 11 weeks later, Kerry finally replied to this well-informed and anxious constituent. I have forwarded your tape to the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General, Department of Transportation, he said in a letter dated back July 24, 2001. Yet Sullivan had made it clear in his letter that going to his old agency was a dead end, because that's what he told them. He and other agents had complained about security lapses for years and got nowhere. The Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General, had become an ineffective overseer of the FAA, he told Kerry. Sullivan suggested he showed the tape to peers on committees with FAA oversight. He even volunteered to testify before them, but he never heard from Kerry again. And so, here you have, in May of 2001, a letter from an FAA official who works in security, who worked for the FBI's department of this, telling them that he got intelligence that there's going to be martyrdom operators hiding inside the United States that are not going to use the traditional methods of hijackings. They're just going to rush the pilots, take over the controls, and crash the planes, which means that the FAA had their primary responsibility to use security measures, such as reinforcing the cockpit doors with better security measures, and also not allowing the flight attendants to carry the cockpit key around their neck, or to basically put a food cart in front of the door to the cockpit, or other security measures, which were never employed. By the way, they should have done this in '96, when the report from the Philippines investigators from this Bajinka operation was forwarded to the FBI. According to Louis Freeh, the director back then, said he forwarded it to the FAA. They did nothing with it. Neither did the FBI. Because the person in charge of that report is Colonel Rodolfo Mendoza. And he basically said that they did nothing with the report. Now, when it comes to traditional hijackings, according to an FAA report, the Crisis Management Handbook for Significant Events, which is dated February 15th of 2000, and from interviews at various FAA centers, air traffic control's first response to an aircraft incident is to notify the supervisor, whether it's from the Boston Center, New York Center, Washington Center, Indianapolis Center. And then from there, they notified the traffic management unit and then the operations manager in charge. So there's a priority list here. The FAA Center now notifies the appropriate regional operations center, which in turn contacts FAA headquarters. When now this is for a traditional hijacking, right? They're not prepared for a martyrdom hijacking where decisions have to be made right then and there. In a traditional hijacking, you have people that hijack the plane, announce their demands, then land somewhere. But the pilot's still alive, not incapacitated, injured, or dead. The United States was totally unprepared for this, but they shouldn't have been. Because according to that letter, which I wrote for you, which I read for you, this should have been taken care of in '96 when the intelligence community and the FAA knew about that there was going to be a threat to airline industry using people that were willing to die. And Ted Walter, you're thinking of traditional hijackings, which is a mistake. Okay? So your first point regarding the hijackings is wrong. Because they didn't put the hijack code, that means the hijackings are impossible to happen? That's irresponsible. End of story. Irresponsible. Now, let's read the 9/11 Commission report on counterterrorism. Here it is. National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. Counterterrorism evolves. Now, if you go all the way down to point 60, which is what I want to read you. Right? So right here. Okay. Right under my screen. So I'm going to blow up this again. This way you can read it together with me. All right. So we can determine what the 9/11 Commission found out from the FAA regarding hijackings, because that's important here. And it's going to start right here. Okay. Where I'm going to read it at. The final layer, security on board commercial aircraft, was not designed to counter suicide hijackings. Because before 9/11, the FAA and the security apparatus of Argonne Bright Security, Massport, the Massachusetts Port Authority, Hunter Lay Security, they were not prepared regarding martyrdom, suicide hijackings. The FAA-approved common strategy had been elaborated over decades of experience with scores of hijackings beginning in the 1960s. It taught flight crews that the best way to deal with hijackers was to accommodate their demands, get the plane to land safely, and then let law enforcement or the military handle the situation. According to the FAA, the record had shown that the longer a hijacking persisted, the more likely it was to end peacefully. The strategy operated on the fundamental assumption that the hijackers issue negotiable demands more often for asylum or the release of a prisoner. And that, as one FAA official put it, suicide wasn't in the game plan of hijackers. FAA training material provided no guidance for flight crews should violence occur. And there you have it. The FAA and airline security industry, as well as the crew, were woefully unprepared for suicide hijackings. And like I said before, Mr. Walter, was that these people were not interested in having their demands met because their decision was made before they even hijacked the planes. It was to rush the cockpit, disable the pilots, and take over the cockpit controls and crash the airplane into the designated target, because the message was clear. Violence was the message. The method and the means were the precursory to it. They didn't care about politics. They didn't care about release of prisoners. They wanted to send the United States a message that you don't understand, Mr. Walter, or most truthers don't, because it's something that you never studied before. The message is relating to U.S. foreign policy through the Wahhabi mentality, not the Islamic mentality. These people aren't Muslims. And I'm pretty sure that you never studied Wahhabism either. These are issues you have to take into account. It's something that I've tried to echo throughout years of uploading material on my channel and to talking with truthers, the advocates, the leaders, self-appointed ones. But they ignored me, called me a 9/11 official denier, a conspiracy theorist. Myself, the official narrative where you defend you're part of the government. Kevin Ryan thinks I'm a CIA agent or officer. He told me this, even though I never commiserated with him before. Now, according to the 9/11 Commission staff statement, which is here, the common strategy. The anti-hijacking training for civil aviation aircraft crews in place on 9/11 was based on previous experience with domestic and international hijacking and other hostage situations. Again, this is the staff statement. The staffers of the 9/11 Commission wrote this. And through their evidence of obtaining from the FAA, from the National Transportation Safety Board, from the security apparatuses at Logan, Dulles, and Newark, from interviewing FAA officials like Monty Belger or Jane Garvey. It was aimed at getting passengers, crew, and hijackers safely landed. It offered little guidance for confronting a suicide hijacking, which the crew was woefully unprepared for. Usually it's a woman that talks to the men because it calms them down. They don't see the woman as a physical threat. In this case, they killed the women because according to the Wahhabi, they degrade women. And in Muhammad Atta's Al-Qaeda manual regarding the hijacking, the plane's operation, they were to use razor blades because to cut the throat of one person and see the blood spray everywhere would fearfully incapacitate anyone to trying to fight back. Or if they even had knives on this plane, which they did. Puts the fear into people, seeing blood splatter everywhere. A person gasping for air while their throat is cut. And according to you armchair quarterbackers, especially in the fringe conspiracy movement, well, they should have fought back. And, I would have, the pilots are tough. They're from Vietnam. Well, they're not so tough. They're strapped into their chairs. And there's a knife to their neck. Air carrier responsibilities for security and anti-hijacking training for flight crews was set forth in the Air Carrier Standard Security Program. In addition to specifying several hours of security training, it provided an outline of in-flight hijacking tactics for both the cockpit and cabin crews. Among other things, this outline advised air crews to refrain from trying to overpower or negotiate with hijackers, to land the aircraft as soon as possible, to communicate with authorities, or to try delaying tactics. That's right. But these people weren't caring. The only tactic that they wanted was to get to the control of the aircraft. Because the pod hijackers had training in flying the plane. They didn't need the pods for anything. Of the FAA, one of the FAA officials most involved with the common strategy in this period leading up to 9/11 described it as an approach dating back to the early 1980s, developed in consultation with the industry and the FBI and based on the historical record of hijackings. The point of the strategy was to optimize actions taken by a flight crew to resolve hijackings peacefully through systematic delay and, if necessary, accommodation of the hijackers. Thus, on September 11, 2001, the common strategy, the last line of defense, offered no defense against the tactics employed by the hijackers of Flight 11, 7793, and 175. And that's the end, because that's right. Because the information to them was outdated. It concentrated on traditional hijackings, that of the 1970s and 80s, when Hezbollah used to hijack planes. Oh, then Arabs could basically hijack planes then. Not on September 11th. They're too stupid to do that, right? So point one, Ted Walter, going back to point one, the hijackings, that it is exceedingly improbable that all 8 pilots of the 4 airliners would have failed to enter the Universal Hijack Code into their transponders, and that all 8 pilots would have either given up control of the aircraft or been incapacitated without first performing a violent flight control maneuver to thwart an invasion of the cockpit is false, as shown by the information I provided. And if you are really an honest advocate for truth, you will now change that first point. You'll admit that it was wrong. I got to think about it. I'm going to give you that chance because you're relatively new. But if what I feel is going to happen is that you're just going to disregard everything I said here, and you're basically going to keep advocating for these points, I'll give you a 3-year window before this organization fails. Unlike other previous organizations, when they started at the height of the truth movement, you're starting at its near extinction. And you're rehashing old debunked points that have been already addressed 22 years prior to the formation of your organization. And so I will see you in the next 2 points videos that I'll make. And I hope to hear back from Ted Walter or from somebody on the board of this panel. I'm not going to hear from Woodworth or Ryan. Maybe Piers Robinson, maybe Ted Walter or James Gorley. I don't even know who that is, but I follow Piers Robinson on Twitter. David Chandler, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes because they're already admitting that, hey, your work is good, but not that good because I'm not going to risk my neck out for you. And you're just going to go along with this. It hurts your reputation because the public sees this. I'm not talking about the fringe public, Mr. Chandler. Talk about when the public sees this, the public that's a little bit aware about 9/11, they're going to say, wow, he fell off. That's exactly what's going to happen to you. So you have to do some thinking here, Mr. Chandler. If you're a real truth advocate, Mr. Walter, you'll make the changes. If not, you won't. See you in the next video.